Welcome to class. Today I'm going to talk about the dramatic moment and scene. Last week I spoke a little bit about scene, but I want to get really specific and put it in this sort of context that we're talking about middles. Middles. Not beginnings, not ends, but middles. Here is a great quote by Sarah Manguso about middles. What interested me was the kind of love to which the person dedicates herself for so long, she no longer remembers quite how it happened or how it began. That sounds like an amazing description of a middle. That is, forgetting how something has begun, getting lost in the story, getting lost in the middle. That's a pleasure for readers, maybe not a pleasure for participants per se. Yet the short story, as opposed to the novel or the novella, the short story, that whole structure of beginning, middle, and end can be sort of grasped within a sort of single train of thought. That's partly what makes the short story so unique, is that it's graspable. The whole process of the story, its entire unfolding, can be sort of envisioned in a thought in a way that a novel or a novella can't. To quote Aaron from Twitter, what we expect from a middle of the story is movement, is shift, is motion. And to quote Cheryl from Twitter, we expect the middle to sort of offer an approach to the story's end. Those are great comments. One of the ways that we do these two things, right, that a story sort of shows its protagonist changing or becoming something other, is through what I would call a scene. A scene. A scene, to define what a scene is, it is writing that represents moment by moment interaction between characters or characters and landscape. So it's a representation, it's a moment by moment interaction between characters. When you read a scene, you feel time slowing down in the moment. It feels like lived life. An aside here, a silent scene is when there's just a single character in a scene, usually interacting with the landscape in some way or shape. A scene in a short story is usually short, 1 or 2 pages. Of course, there are exceptions to this. The great writers like Alice Munro and Deborah Eisenberg offer extended 5-6 page scenes. Here's what a scene does, if you think about it. It either advances conflict, that is, it heightens conflict, and I'm talking about the conflict between the characters, but also the conflict inside of a character, or it releases that conflict. A scene might little by little advance conflict, or a scene might just little by little release the conflict, or the release of that conflict might be only momentary. The reader's first job is to consider where the narrator or point of view character is at the scene's beginning, and sort of to focus our attention there. Locate the protagonist in the sort of space of the story. For example, in the opening scene of College Town 1980, Dolores is sitting in the booth. She's next to this box of overwatered, crowded plants. She's at a diner that she frequents, and we know that she's wearing a scarf to cover up the fact that she's pulling out her hair. She feels invisible already at the beginning of this scene. It's important to locate her as the story's protagonist. A lot of folks have been kind of focused by very strongly sort of active secondary characters. I found that in your essays and your comments. But I really want us to really be first and foremost paying attention to the story's protagonist, that is the narrator or the point of view character. A scene makes use of all of the methods of characterization: action, speech or dialogue, appearance, how a protagonist looks, and thoughts. What is a character thinking? What is a character remembering or dreaming? Another word for that is interiority. So a scene makes use of all of those methods, and often there's really nice conflict between those methods. So, in other words, a character's thoughts or a character's perceptions might belie their actions, right? I mean, just think about Dolores. She's feeling invisible. She feels like Teresa hates her, yet her speech really doesn't, reveal that per se. She's just trying to order a coffee and her apricot roll. A scene uses secondary characters. Secondary characters press the protagonist. They challenge the protagonist. They often sort of help the scene externalize the protagonist's inner conflict. There are many ways in which scenes work. Sometimes you have characters kind of battling each other. Other times you have just two very different people kind of looking at the same thing. Or you might have two characters that are sort of moving in and out of connection and disconnection, emotional attachment and detachment. There's a lot of different ways in which a secondary character is put to use. If you think about the waitress in the opening scene of College Town 1980, supposedly she despises Dolores and she has aspirations to open an abortion clinic. And she's very much irritated, clearly irritated by Dolores. And she even sort of very advertently but quietly brushes her hip against the table and knocks Dolores' pills off. She's really challenging Dolores in many different ways. The scene, that opening scene, and like all scenes, makes use of staging. How and where the characters are in relation to one another. Staging also includes populating a scene with objects. Those objects often become sort of emblems or carriers of the emotional conflict of the story. So in that scene, we have, Dolores sitting in this booth. She's sort of at one point reaching under the table for her pills that Teresa has knocked off. She's bent over in the moment that Teresa comes up and actually takes her order. It's really subtle yet potent staging. Dolores is always sort of in this sort of what I would call weak sort of physical position in relation to Teresa. Scenes also make use of dialogue. Characters speak to one another. Most of the time, characters are speaking at what I would call cross purposes. That is, they lie, they omit, they confess, they hide. They're sort of not quite responding to one another. Their own desires or their own needs often make spoken communication really, really challenging. The waitress, for instance, tells Dolores that they don't have apricot rolls. And in the next paragraph, we find out she sees that they have a whole bunch of apricot rolls. scenes make use of action. Action is really important because that is usually what shows or signals the movement. The protagonist of any short story is becoming something other, and it's the actions that really indicate that change. And that's how it is in our lives. We make different kinds of decisions, we take action in different ways, and as we take action, we feel ourselves, we feel a strange sense of being in the world. We're changing. And we also see that we're impacting humans around us in different ways. Dolores, in this sort of beginning scene, seems to be becoming more and more invisible, right? By the end of that opening part of the scene, she's ordered a coffee and she's attempted to order an apricot roll, and the Teresa takes off to go get Dolores' food, and Teresa, of course, spies, Dolores spies Teresa with that plate of apricot rolls. And she's also cleaning the spill of her gloves. Teresa spilled coffee on that mulberry-colored gloves. And, of course, she's knocked her pills over once again. So we really feel her invisibility, her ineptitude sort of rising in that scene. All right, last quick comment. I just wanted to give everybody a warning about Mary Gaitskill. She's a different kind of writer than the other writers we have read. Often she's writing very kind of unlikable characters. So let's be compassionate for these sort of flawed souls in our discussions, and really attempt to see them as complex beings, and sort of focus our reading on that, even if you sort of feel a certain distaste for those characters. Anyway, there we go. Good talk.